Somewhere in the folds of the Caucasus Mountains, where the air tastes of pine resin and ancient stone, where the wind carries the echo of languages that no longer exist, there is a fortress that has no name on most maps. It clings to a cliff face above a river gorge so deep that the water below sounds like a whisper rather than a roar. The walls are black with centuries of smoke, and if you press your palm against the stone, you might ask yourself a question that no historian has ever fully answered. How did a kingdom this small, this remote, this geographically strangled between empires that could have swallowed it whole a dozen times over, survive? How did it not merely survive, but at one extraordinary moment in history, become one of the most powerful and sophisticated Christian realms on earth? The Kingdom of Georgia is not a story most Western viewers know. And that is a scandal of historical memory, because what happened in this sliver of land between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea across more than 15 centuries is one of the most astonishing tales of cultural endurance, political cunning, military defiance, and human stubbornness ever recorded. We know about the Crusades, we know about Byzantium, we know about the great Islamic Caliphates and the Mongol storm, but we rarely ask what happened to the people caught between all of them, the people who refused to disappear. In 337 AD, give or take a few years, depending on which source you trust, a kingdom called Kartli, the ancient heartland of what would become Georgia, made a decision that would define everything that followed. It adopted Christianity, not as a political convenience, though politics would soon make it desperately convenient, but through a story that Georgians still tell with the reverence of something true. A woman named Nino, a Cappadocian slave or missionary, or both depending on the account, healed the queen of an illness that no physician could touch. The king converted. The court converted. And a nation began to build its identity around a cross that would become, over the coming centuries, not just a religious symbol, but a battle standard, a diplomatic credential, a reason to fight, and sometimes a reason to die. What you are about to watch is the real story of that cross, and the kingdom that bled for it across 1,000 years of fire. To understand how Georgia survived, you must first understand what it was surrounded by, and what it was made of internally, because neither story is simple. The Caucasus in late antiquity was not a borderland. It was a battlefield between two of the ancient world's most sophisticated and aggressive empires. To the west and south, Rome, and then its eastern successor, Byzantium, stretched its influence like long fingers into every court and caravan route it could reach. To the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, one of the most administratively brilliant and militarily formidable states the ancient world ever produced, pressed with equal hunger. Georgia sat between them, and the great Georgian noble houses, the Aristavi, the regional lords who controlled the mountain passes and the fertile valleys, played one empire against the other with a skill that would make a modern diplomat envious. But this was not a clean or glorious game. The early Christian kingdom was fractured. The nobility fought each other with as much energy as they fought foreign invaders. The Catholicos, the head of the Georgian church, accumulated enormous power that sometimes rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of the king himself. And the question of which Persian or Byzantine faction a particular noble house favored could tear a family apart across generations. When the Sassanids tightened their grip in the 5th century and attempted to suppress Christianity in favor of Zoroastrianism, the Georgian response was not unified heroism. It was complicated, agonizing, and at times deeply compromised. Some nobles converted under pressure, some fled, some fought. The martyrdom of the Iberian nobles in this period, men and women who died rather than renounced their faith, was real and documented. But it existed alongside a parallel history of accommodation and survival. Georgia's Christianity was never pure. It was forged in the furnace of geopolitical necessity, and the people who shaped it were not saints in the storybook sense. They were survivors, making impossible choices in a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished idealism with a consistency that left no room for illusion. Then came the Arabs. In the 7th century, the Islamic Caliphate erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula with a military and ideological momentum that shattered two of the ancient world's great powers in the span of a single generation. Byzantium lost its richest provinces. Persia ceased to exist as an independent state. Georgia was overrun. Tbilisi, the city that had grown into the kingdom's commercial and political heart, fell and became an Arab emirate, a Muslim enclave in the middle of the Caucasus that would endure for more than 3 centuries. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange and genuinely interesting, because the Arab Emirate of Tbilisi and the Georgian kingdoms that surrounded it did not exist in a state of permanent apocalyptic war. They traded, they negotiated, they occasionally allied against common enemies. The picture that emerges from the chronicles of this period is not a simple clash of civilizations, but something far more human and far more complicated. A set of overlapping relationships defined by profit and power as much as by faith. But the pressure was real, and the demographic and cultural transformation that the Arab presence threatened was real, and the Georgian response was to do something remarkable. The noble houses that had spent centuries fighting each other began slowly and then with increasing urgency to consolidate. The Bagrationi dynasty, whose origins are obscure enough that later chroniclers claimed descent from the biblical King David, which tells you something about how mythology and legitimacy operate in medieval political culture, began to draw the fractured Georgian principalities into a single gravitational field. It took generations. It required marriages, betrayals, military campaigns, and mountain terrain that broke the spirit of every would-be conqueror, and a patient accumulation of ecclesiastical support that turned the church into the ideological backbone of a unified Georgian identity. By the late 10th century, Bagrat III unified most of the Georgian lands under a single crown. It was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of something astonishing. The Golden Age was coming, and it would arrive in the form of a woman, Queen Tamar. Let that name sit for a moment. Tamar, who came to the throne of Georgia in 1184, who ruled until 1213, who is the only monarch in Georgian history to be canonized as a saint by the Georgian Orthodox Church, and who presided over a period of military expansion, cultural flowering, and political organization that transformed a battered mountain kingdom into a regional power that stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian, that controlled trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Central Asia, and that patronized some of the greatest literature, architecture, and art that the medieval world produced. The military campaigns of her reign pushed Georgian borders to their greatest extent. Her generals, among them the brilliant Zakhare and Ivan Zakarian, who were themselves Armenian Christians operating in the service of a Georgian queen, won victories against multiple rival powers that seemed on paper to be far stronger than anything Georgia could field. But here is the uncomfortable question that Tamar's reign also forces us to ask. The expansion was not bloodless. The territories absorbed were not always absorbed willingly. The peoples brought under Georgian authority did not all share Georgian religion, and the treatment of those peoples was not always the enlightened tolerance that later Romantic nationalism would claim. The Golden Age of Georgia was real. The poetry of Shota Rustaveli, the epic Vepkist Kaosani, The Knight in the Panther's Skin, written in this period, is genuinely one of the masterpieces of world medieval literature, a sophisticated, humanist, philosophically rich work that would hold its own against anything produced in Western Europe in the same century. The churches and monasteries carved into cliff faces and raised on mountain peaks are genuine architectural wonders. But the empire built on that cultural foundation was still an empire. And empires have costs that tend to be paid by people who do not appear in the official chronicles. Tamar was extraordinary. She was also a conqueror. And history asks us to hold both of those truths at the same time, without flinching from either. What came after Tamar was the Mongol storm, and there is almost no way to describe what the Mongol invasions of the 13th century did to Georgia that does not sound like hyperbole, except that it is not hyperbole. It is the documented archaeological and demographic reality. Cities were depopulated. Agricultural systems that had functioned for millennia were destroyed. The trade networks that had made the Golden Age possible were severed. The Bagrationi dynasty survived, technically, but as vassals, paying tribute, sending soldiers to fight in Mongol armies, watching their kingdom shrink back from its greatest extent to something much more precarious. And then the Timurids came in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, and Timur, Tamerlane, the conqueror who built pyramids of skulls outside the cities he sacked, invaded Georgia no fewer than 8 times. 8 times. The Ottomans pressed from the west, the Safavid Persians pressed from the east, Georgia fragmented into competing kingdoms and principalities again, the old centrifugal forces reasserting themselves under unbearable pressure. And yet, the language survived. The church survived. The script, that extraordinary Georgian alphabet that looks like no other writing system on earth, survived. The manuscripts were hidden in monastery walls and mountain caves. The liturgies were sung in ruins by priests who had nowhere else to go. Today, the Republic of Georgia is a small nation of fewer than 4 million people, navigating its existence between a Russia that has occupied portions of its territory and a Western alliance that has offered promises without always delivering the security those promises implied. The ancient question that Georgia has always faced, how does a small, strategically located, resource-rich, culturally distinctive people maintain its identity and sovereignty in a world of large and hungry neighbors, is not a historical question. It is today's question. It is asked every morning in Tbilisi. And the answer that 15 centuries of Georgian history whispers back is not a comfortable one. It says that survival is never guaranteed. It says that identity is not a gift, but a daily act of will. It says that the fortress does not protect the people. The people are the fortress. And it asks you, quietly, as the credits begin to roll and the mountain wind picks up and the ancient stones hold their silence, whether the walls around the things you believe in are still standing.